who are your honourable mentions in the lead-out category, Benji?
The likes of a Jasper de Buys, maybe not at the highest level, but he did it for Arno Dali in those 1.1 races where Dali was really strong. A Jasper Stuyven at the Tour de France, but like you mentioned, we're talking about the top-level races. A Kirsch for Pedersen at the Vuelta. Those are mentions that are possible. A Sinkeldam at the Giro. And also the two of the bigger ones, I think, for me, which is Christophe Laporte and Danny van Poppel. But if I go over these riders, then I would argue that when I look at the likes of a Jasper Stuyven, yes, his leadouts, I think there was one good leadout in stage 2 of the Tour de France where Pedersen ends up going really early, but Stuyven is not necessarily the rider I think of when I think about, oh, this is the best leadout of 2022, because it's so minimal the amount of times that we see him doing these leadouts, and they're not always perfect either. And when it comes to the best, it's not on the highest level. So those two fall out of the top for me in this. Jonas Ricard, a rider that last year would have been top notch on my list, was injured this year for the majority. So he can't be competing for this trophy. A Molano, yeah, wonderful lead out if you want your lead out to win, but not if you want your sprinter to win.
But this show, as always, is brought to you by Zwift. Whether you're just starting out on your cycling journey or looking for those final tune-ups ahead of a big event or race, Zwift is the online cycling platform that makes things fun, as well as being the named sponsor of the Tour de France Femme avec Zwift and this podcast. If you want to find out more about Zwift, the platform, the race, go to Zwift.com, and if you want to try it out, you can get a free 7-day trial.
And an interesting name that I haven't mentioned too much is Mikkel Mørkøv. Like, what happened to Mikkel Mørkøv after 2022? He had a DNS at the Giro after getting sick, I think. I recall that he was planning to leave that Giro anyway, but he was gotten out earlier because of an illness. OTL at the Tour de France after that, look what looked like also an illness as well. And next to that, when he was doing leadouts, like at the intermediates at the Tour de France, they weren't necessarily the best leadouts, as in he didn't have the energy to bring Jakobsen up late towards the last part of that intermediate, for example, to get Jakobsen right. But I will say, despite the Tour de France not being good enough and the other races around that not necessarily being the best leadouts, I would still argue that his leadouts at the Giro, like in Balaton Furet, for example, stage 3, were good. I do think that Cavendish was left off the front early. So, I don't know, Mørkøv was not perfect this year. Last year, he was by far the best lead out in my eyes. This year, he was not. And I would argue that he's not in my top 3. I feel like the Jakobsen-Mørkøv chemistry didn't work out as much as the Bennett-Mørkøv chemistry in the second year of their cooperation last year. Do you agree that he's not in the top 3 of this?
Yeah, I mean, when you see this year at intermediate sprints getting dropped, like he couldn't even bring forward Jakobsen. He never really brought Jakobsen forward. In the Danish stages, Jakobsen was just on the wheel of Van Aert and won. And then stage 3, Jakobsen was just missed the corner, and Mørkøv was on the front, actually. That was kind of Jakobsen's fault, but even so, if Jakobsen was on the wheel, he would have been left there too early. Yeah, I think we didn't see like the dominant lead-outs of last year, and it was the younger guys, Danny van Poppel and Christophe Laporte, who almost took the Mørkøv level lead-outs to another level, where they surged from the back really late, particularly Van Poppel did, bring his guy from sixth wheel at huge speed, particularly in the Vuelta with Bennett, and they just have to almost keep the speed up, and they can't lose. And so when I'm thinking of best leader, I'm thinking who made their sprinter win more races than they would have otherwise. Like, Lionel Tamino, I don't think made Jasper Philipsen win any more races than he would have, even though he was occasionally doing the last man duties. Mezgets we see kind of disappear from this category completely as well. I don't even know who Groenewegen's last man was this year. So I think it's pretty clear cut for 1 and 2. Third is difficult. Third is difficult between a Sinkeldam, who was good in just sort of second last man duties for Demar
But
in the Giro, and Kirsch.
when it comes to Sinkeldam, we do need to mention that Guarnieri was nowhere in that Giro, which led to the two stage wins where Demar ends up winning. That Sinkeldam was the last man in those two stages. I checked back a
True.
bit earlier, and that does say to me that perhaps he does have that last man duty. Or would you say that those Giro level sprints, there were no really, I think there was a few good sprints when it comes to Mercu doing a good lead out for Cavendish there in week one. But outside of that, I'd argue there was no team that really took it on and really had it in that Giro, which might have given a Sinkeldam and Demar a bit more compared to what would have happened at a UAE Tour or a Tour de France level lead out situation, because that's where Danny van Poppel, for example, really struck. Like at UAE, you were saying, okay, Danny van Poppel might be the best lead out in the world. And we weren't even at the Vuelta yet, where he did those two wonderful lead outs for Bennett. He did multiple other lead outs throughout the season, like Ronde van Limburg, that sprint where Danny van Poppel did that crazy lead out and ended up beating Sam Bennett on the line. Like, that's situations where you see that the sprinter makes the lead out look bad. That's happened so much throughout the years where a lead out can be doing such good lead outs, but the sprinter, Bennett in this occasion, was not at the level to actually make it happen. And therefore, it kind of looks like the lead out didn't do his job properly. But Danny van Poppel had a crazy season. He's indeed in that top three for me. Shall we go to lining up the top three? Because, like, do you think the Danny van Poppel versus Laporte situation is controversial? Do you think it's close on your
Nah,
end?
I think it's clearly Van Poppel, because I really don't recall him making a significant mistake. I would say Laporte made a pretty big mistake on the third stage of the Tour de France when he went to the outside of Mercu when he should have gone to the inside, and Mercu pulled off. It detached Van Aert from his wheel, and Van Aert ended up losing a photo finish. So that cost the Tour de France stage win. And I would say Van Poppel was doing almost the opposite. Like, I mean, Van Aert, we see sometimes struggles in the small group sprints. Was he doing better in those Tour de France sprints mainly because of Laporte or with Laporte's help? Yes, Laporte helped. Paris-Nice, when Jakobsen beat Wout in that sprint easily, Laporte's lead out was insane. But Van Poppel, just UAE Tour and UAE Tour of Vuelta, and then the lead out for Jakobsen in the European Championships has to be counted too. He was just unbelievable. So I'm giving him a clear edge over Laporte, who was very, very good, but just, a proud second. Third, I'm still struggling. I still struggle between a Kirsch, Sturven, a Sinkeldam, and because De Boist, I can't give it to anyone on Lotto. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of I can't do it. I think I will give it to who was, I can't remember who the Intermarché guy was, but I think I will give it to Kirsch
Gofisu?
because I know
No.
Pozzo did lead out.
And Bardet for
Pozzo,
Dainese.
yeah, they did it. Darnell was good at Trek as well, but I'm going to give it to Kirsch, which might be a bit
Okay.
unfair to Sinkeldam. It might be recency bias, but I'm stretching the definition of lead out a little bit. But I think Kirsch was instrumental in setting up sprint victories this year, not just in the Vuelta. So I'm giving Kirsch third.
Okay, an understandable top three. I've got a different one, as in I have Sinkeldam in the third spot. I believe that without Sinkeldam, Demar probably doesn't take those Giro stages because the positioning that he was put in is really strong. That being said, I do have to say that Demar was good at the Giro in general. Like, he was on level again. And we look at Laporte versus Van Poppel, and I agree with your remarks when it comes to that. Van Poppel made no real mistakes throughout the season. Laporte made a few throughout the season, but on the opposite end, Laporte also took a lot more on his plate. So while I put Van Poppel on number one, I'd argue that I have Laporte a bit closer to Van Poppel because Laporte has been a bit more versatile in having to spend his energy and was still there when he needed to be on those sprint stages.
I didn't count at least Laporte doing uphill lead outs for Wout to attack. I'm talking sprints only.